Okay, so when you look at a kid just sitting in a classroom, staring up at the whiteboard, there's this invisible, almost philosophical tug of war happening right above their head.
Oh, absolutely. And the question at the center of that tug of war is, well, it's surprisingly profound, right?
Yeah.
Who actually owns that child's mind?
Right. Is it the parents, the local community,
Yep.
or, is it the state? So today, we are doing a deep dive into a highly provocative, just incredibly sweeping critique of modern education. It's based on excerpts from the book 2025 U.S. Launches Correction by Young Kang. But right out of the gate, we need to set some firm ground rules for you, the listener.
Yeah, that's crucial because the source material we have today dives straight into deeply politically charged territory.
Very charged. We are looking at right-wing conservative arguments about the role of government, religion, and civil society in education. And I want to be super clear here. Neither of us are endorsing or taking sides on these viewpoints.
Right? Our mission is strictly to impartially report, unpack, and analyze the original author's arguments. We just want to give you a clear, balanced understanding of the ideas in the text so you can evaluate them for yourself.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, the argument being made in this text is vast.
Hmm.
Like, whether you agree with the author's conclusions or not, the sheer scale of the critique really demands attention. We aren't just looking at a contemporary political policy proposal here.
No, not at all.
The author is actually tracing a 500-year historical argument. We're going to explore why the text argues the U.S. Federal Department of Education must be completely abolished.
Which is a huge claim.
It is, and we'll get into how public education actually started, which, spoiler alert, was not for the reasons most people assume.
Yeah, that part blew my mind.
Right, and finally, we'll examine this fierce philosophical battle over who holds the ultimate moral authority to raise a child.
Okay, let's dive right in. The catalyst for this entire argument starts with President Trump's stated goal of abolishing the Federal Department of Education, potentially in a 2025 term.
Yeah.
And normally, like when the idea of abolishing a federal agency comes up, the conversation immediately defaults to budget cuts, right? Slashing red tape or reducing administrative bloat. But the author argues that the financial aspect is entirely secondary.
Yeah, completely secondary. The author's why is deeply rooted in political philosophy,
Yeah.
specifically the concept of local autonomy.
Okay, unpack that for us.
So according to the text, the cornerstone of the American federal system isn't a strong central hub, but rather the independence of local communities. The author points out that the 13 original states had full local autonomy long before the federal government even existed.
Right, they were essentially their own little countries in a way.
Exactly. The original design was a shared sovereignty, but with the states clearly holding the upper hand when it came to domestic life.
But the author claims that balance has been fundamentally broken, right? Especially over the last century. Like, if you think about the federal government, it was originally designed to be like a highly specialized software program.
I like that analogy, yeah.
It's just running in the background, handling very specific tasks like national defense or foreign policy. But the text argues that since World War II, that software has acted more like a virus.
A virus that's demanding more and more control over the local operating systems.
Exactly, effectively rewriting the code of state sovereignty. And they argue this was largely facilitated by decisions from the federal Supreme Court. It resulted in what the author describes as an omnipotent government led primarily by Democratic politicians. But I have to push back here a little bit on behalf of the listener. Like, wait, doesn't a federal department ensure equal standards? Doesn't it act as a safeguard to make sure every kid, whether they live in a wealthy zip code or a struggling rural town, gets a baseline education?
Well, the author fundamentally rejects the premise that federal baselines are a net positive. The text argues that the pursuit of these federal standards is exactly what created this omnipotent government in the first place.
Wow, so the baselines are the problem.
According to the author, yes. The core goal of the book isn't to fix the federal baselines, but to completely dismantle them and return to the Founding Fathers' vision of a limited government.
So abolishing the Federal Department of Education is just, what, step one?
Exactly. It's framed as merely step one.
Okay, so if the Department of Education is just the visible symptom of a much older disease, according to the author, and eliminating it is step one, what's step two?
Step two is for state governments to take that newly returned educational authority and hand it completely over to civil society and the private sector.
Completely, like no government involvement at all.
None. The text explicitly states that the government at any level is not the responsible entity for a child's education.
The parents are.
Right, the parents.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal is to force America back onto what the author calls the correct path of small government, large society.
Okay, if the end goal is to completely remove the government from the classroom, I feel like we really need to understand how the state got the power to mandate education in the first place.
Mm.
Because the text takes us way back, right? Like long before the American founding fathers.
Oh, yeah. It takes us way back to the baseline of European history.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. So, before the 16th century, primarily in England and continental Europe, public schools simply did not exist.
At all.
Not at all. If a child received any kind of primary education, it was provided entirely by the church or by private tutors if the family happened to be wealthy.
Wow. So there was literally no compulsory education, no government mandates, no truancy officers banging on your door.
Nothing of the sort. And this is where the author pinpoints a very specific moment in history as the catalyst for state-run education.
And it wasn't spearheaded by an educational reformer, right? Or
Sure.
some philosopher of childhood development?
Nope. It was Martin Luther in the year 1524.
Wait, Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation.
The very same. During the early days of the Reformation, Luther proposed that the government should step in, establish schools, and force parents to send their children to them.
But the text argues he didn't do this because he had some modern progressive vision of universal literacy, did he? Like, he wasn't trying to just make sure everyone could read the classics.
Not at all. According to the text, Luther's proposal was a highly strategic political maneuver aimed directly at crippling the Catholic Church.
Oh, wow. So it was a weapon.
Exactly. Luther needed a way to counter Catholic influence over the populace. By shifting the responsibility of education from the church to the state, he could ensure the next generation was taught outside of Catholic doctrine.
But in doing so, the author argues, Luther inadvertently handed the government an incredibly dangerous tool for societal control.
That's the argument, yeah. He essentially built a weapon to fight the Pope and accidentally birthed the modern state education system.
That is wild. And once that idea was out there, that the state could compel a child to learn what the state wanted them to learn, it just spread like wildfire.
It did. The text traces this massive global domino effect. It started with small German states issuing compulsory education laws.
Right.
Then, in 1717, King Frederick William I of Prussia mandated primary education nationwide.
The machinery just kept expanding.
Expanding and normalizing. Britain followed in 1870 with the Elementary Education Act for children aged 5 to 12, and then France enacted the Ferry Act in 1881.
And that one established free, compulsory, and strictly secular education, right?
Yes, exactly.
So Europe spends a couple of centuries building the machinery of government-led education. But the author's argument takes a really sharp turn when this machinery crosses the Atlantic.
It does.
Because the text argues that once the system arrived in the United States, it was weaponized by a very specific ideological movement.
Right, and this brings us to the early 20th century in the U.S. during the Progressive Era. The author focuses heavily on a group described as rationally self-confident, left-wing liberal intellectuals.
That is quite the label.
Yeah, it is. And the core belief of this group, which the text heavily critiques, is the concept that human nature is essentially a blank slate.
Okay, let's explore the mechanics of that blank slate idea for a second. Because if a teacher believes a child is a blank slate, that changes everything about what happens in the classroom, doesn't it?
It changes the entire foundation of education.
Right, because it means the child isn't a complex individual with an innate soul or some predetermined moral compass that needs to be discovered. They are just unformed clay.
Exactly.
And if human nature is just clay, it means it can be entirely shaped, engineered, and manufactured through incentives, punishments, and curriculum.
Precisely. And if you hold that belief, then government-controlled public schools are no longer just places to learn math and reading.
What do they become?
They become the ultimate factories for shaping a new society. And the text identifies one specific figure as the main architect of this shift.
John Dewey.
Yes, John Dewey. He was a leading figure in the progressive movement and just a massive name in American educational philosophy.
Oh, huge. But the author's critique of him is absolutely brutal. Let me quote the text directly for you. If American education were a farmer, Dewey would be the poisonous snake in the farmer's arms.
It doesn't get much harsher than that.
It really doesn't. The author identifies Dewey as the absolute destroyer of the American education system because of his philosophy of pragmatism.
Right.
But I think we really need to define how pragmatism operates in this specific context. Because, in everyday conversation, being pragmatic just means being practical.
Yeah, doing what works.
Exactly. And wanting your kids to learn practical skills so they can get a job, that seems like a good thing, right? Like, why does the author view this practicality as a poisonous snake?
Well, the author argues that Dewey's version of pragmatism goes far beyond just vocational training. In Dewey's framework, at least as interpreted by the text, whatever's practical is inherently good, and whatever's impractical is bad.
Okay.
So it centers a person's entire value system around physical and social survival. Truth is no longer absolute. Truth becomes relative to whatever solves the immediate problem in front of you.
So intellect is downgraded from a profound human capability to merely a tool for adaptation.
Exactly. And the text points out that Dewey was heavily influenced by Darwin. He viewed humans essentially as evolving animals whose nature could be socially engineered.
Okay, and for the author, this is the fatal flaw, right?
It is. By making truth relative and treating the mind just as a biological tool, the text argues that Dewey's pragmatism actively rejected absolute truths based on Christian beliefs. It stripped away the concept of divine justice.
Wow, so it wasn't just a curriculum shift, it was a spiritual shift.
That's the argument. The author claims this philosophy transformed public schools into a base for a secular state religion.
A state religion, like worshiping the government.
Not of those exact words, but it's a blind institutional faith in the government's ability to engineer human society and define what is actually true.
The author essentially argues that the progressive movement replaced God with the government.
Yes.
And once you do that, the government starts acting as the true parent of the children, superseding the authority of the actual family.
Right. And the text even cites a 1997 book on the history of American higher education to back this up, showing how Dewey's pragmatism replaced classical rationalism.
And in classical rationalism, developing the intellect to understand deep moral truths was the very purpose of education.
Exactly. Pragmatism threw that out and basically said, no, the purpose of education is just social adjustment and survival.
So we have this resulting philosophy where the state believes it possesses a superior rational methodology, where children are blank slates to be molded, and where the government assumes the role of the ultimate parent.
Right. And the author argues that this is an incredibly dangerous combination of hubris and state power.
And to prove just how dangerous it is, the text points to a really devastating historical case study. But honestly, this is where I really need to pause and question the source material.
Okay, why is that?
Because the text jumps from a philosophical critique of John Dewey in the U.S. Department of Education all the way to Australia in the year 1910. Specifically, the stolen generation.
Yes, it's a massive leap.
The author is leaping from curriculum changes in America to the systemic, government-sanctioned abduction of Indigenous children in Australia. That is a highly disturbing connection. How does the text even justify connecting an administrative department in Washington to severe human rights abuses?
It's a heavy comparison. The connection the author is drawing is based on the shared underlying premise of state superiority over parental rights.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So the text details how the Australian government, operating under the assumption that the local Indigenous population was ignorant and, quote, doomed to disappear, implemented a policy rooted in the belief that the state knew what was best for those children.
Right, so the state thought it was the better parent.
Exactly. Authorities were legally allowed to forcibly remove mixed-race Aboriginal children from their families and place them into government-run institutions.
The author uses this to demonstrate the logical extreme of state-led education.
Yes. The text notes that around 100,000 children were forcibly taken.
It's horrifying. The sheer scale of the psychological and cultural trauma inflicted on those families is just staggering. I mean, it took nearly a century, until 2008, for the Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, to formally apologize on behalf of the government for the policies that created the stolen generation.
That's a very dark chapter. And the author includes this tragedy to showcase the extreme dark side of that progressive assumption.
The assumption that the state knows best.
Right. When the state truly believes it possesses a superior truth and that its educational institutions are better equipped to raise a child than the child's own parents, it can justify unspeakable cruelty under the guise of education and civilization. The author is arguing that the fundamental philosophy empowering the U.S. Department of Education shares that same dangerous DNA, the belief that the state owns the child.
It's presented as the ultimate warning against the state acting as a parent. So if a centralized, pragmatic, state-led education system is the disease, what is the author's proposed cure?
Well, the cure, according to the text, is a complete return to the classical roots of education,
Yeah.
one that is deeply grounded in conservative thought, civil society, and Christian faith.
Okay.
And to explain this, the author contrasts the immediate purpose of education with what they call the ultimate purpose.
So Dewey's pragmatism represents that immediate purpose, teaching a kid how to balance a spreadsheet, how to adapt to a workplace, how to literally survive in the economy.
Right, and the author views focusing solely on that immediate purpose as incredibly short-sighted, even destructive.
Why destructive?
Because the ultimate purpose of education, on the other hand, is about acquiring wisdom, achieving spiritual freedom, and perceiving the eternal. It's not about training someone to be a compliant worker.
So it's about developing their capacity to think independently.
Exactly. To discern moral good from evil and to appreciate objective beauty.
Okay, and the text brings in several prominent conservative scholars to mechanically explain how we lost this ultimate purpose.
Yeah, one of them is Richard Weaver, who is a highly influential University of Chicago professor.
Right, and Weaver argued that modern education has completely lost interest in wisdom and now only focuses on cultivating makers.
Yes, makers. And a maker, in Weaver's view, is essentially just a tool for the economy.
So a maker knows how to write computer code or engineer a bridge, but they have no framework for deciding why they should or shouldn't build those things.
Precisely. They lack moral agency. Weaver believed education should cultivate complete individuals with free will, people who, in his words, refuse to be enslaved.
I find the way the text explains Weaver's view on logic really fascinating. Like, Weaver argued that logic has been grammarized.
Grammarized, yeah. It's a great concept.
It really is. Think about how a high school debate team operates today. They are taught the mechanics of arguing, how to spot a fallacy, how to structure a rebuttal, but they aren't actually taught to care about the fundamental truth of what they are arguing.
They just want to win the points.
Exactly. So logic devolved from a discipline meant to uncover divine truth into a mechanical discipline that just teaches you how to speak correctly and win an argument. The moral core has just been hollowed out.
It is a profound critique of modern academia's focus on process over truth. And the author pairs Weaver with another major figure, Allen Bloom.
Right, who wrote the incredibly influential 1987 book, The Closing of the American Mind.
Yes. Bloom argued that post-World War II American higher education had been completely overtaken by three forces.
Positivism, relativism, and nihilism.
Those are the three.
So we need to define how those three forces actually impact a student's worldview. Positivism is basically the idea that if you can't prove something scientifically in a lab, it isn't real. So abstract concepts like divine justice or absolute morality are just discarded. Relativism naturally follows. If there is no absolute moral truth, then your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth.
Which we hear all the time now.
All the time. And that ultimately leads to nihilism, the belief that nothing actually matters and life has no intrinsic meaning. Bloom claimed that by forcing these philosophies onto students, academia had just become a tool of progressive propaganda.
It's a really bleak picture he paints. And Bloom's critique goes even further into contemporary issues. The text highlights his sharp criticism of what modern universities call multiculturalism.
Yeah, this is a really provocative observation. The author uses Bloom to argue that Western multiculturalism isn't actually driven by a genuine desire to learn from non-Western cultures.
Far from it, according to him.
Right. Instead, Bloom claims it's a new imperialism. The argument is that American universities are taking highly specific, politically correct academic fields like gender studies, race studies, and LGBTQ studies and exporting them abroad.
And the author views this not as cultural democratization, but as American academic imperialism overriding local traditional cultures around the world.
So the author uses Bloom to argue that the modern educational establishment is not just failing students domestically by stripping away their moral framework, but it is actively spreading a harmful relativistic ideology globally.
That's exactly the claim.
Okay, so if the text advocates tearing down the Department of Education, dismantling Dewey's pragmatism, and rejecting the academic establishment's relativism, who is supposed to step into that massive void? Like, who actually holds the authority to educate a child if not the government?
For the ultimate solution, the text turns to Edmund Burke, widely considered the founder of modern conservatism.
Okay.
The author quotes Burke praising an educational system where authority is held entirely by civil society, specifically the church.
The church.
Yeah. Burke envisions a society where clergymen act not as submissive attendants to the state, but as rigorous companions and moral guides to the youth.
So they are the ones shaping the minds.
Right. The author concludes that civil society, local communities, and the private sector must reclaim educational authority to save the soul of the next generation.
Wow. When you pull all these historical and philosophical threads together, the sheer scale of the author's argument is just breathtaking. Abolishing the Federal Department of Education for this author is clearly not a budget cut.
No, it's so much bigger than that.
It is an attempt to reverse a 500-year historical trend that started with Martin Luther trying to outmaneuver the Catholic Church. It is a mission to dethrone John Dewey's pragmatism, to utterly reject the idea that children are blank slates for the state to mold,
Yeah.
and to return the moral authority of raising a child entirely back to the parents, the church, and civil society.
It represents a total paradigm shift. And honestly, analyzing this text leaves us with a deeply provocative thought for you to ponder.
Oh, what is it?
If education is entirely removed from the government, like if it is completely decentralized and returned strictly to private, local, and religious spheres, how does a modern, highly interconnected society maintain a shared baseline of facts and reality?
That's a great question.
Without a central standard, do we just fracture into thousands of isolated realities?
Or, if we take the author's perspective to heart, is a single government-mandated shared reality exactly the trap we should be trying to escape? Is a manufactured consensus just another form of control?
Exactly.
It brings us right back to that invisible tug of war in the classroom. Who really owns the mind? It's a question that clearly doesn't have an easy answer, but understanding the history behind the battle changes how you look at the entire system. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material, and as always, keep questioning the structures around you.